The prevailing strategic narrative is a calculated diversion. All analysis focuses on kinetic threats, hypersonic missiles, carrier battle groups, drone swarms. This is misdirection. The 21st century kill shot is not an explosion. It is silence. The entire architecture of Western economic and military power runs on data transmitted through a few dozen highly vulnerable undersea fiber optic cables. Severing these is not an act of war. It is an act of systemic liquidation. The second vector is orbital. GPS, ISR, and communication satellites constitute the optic nerve of the state. The kill chain does not require expensive anti-satellite missiles. It requires only a denial-of-service attack, a signal jam, a cyber intrusion. When you sever the undersea cables and blind the orbital assets, the global hegemon becomes a blind leviathan, a titan of immense kinetic power, suddenly without sensory input or a central nervous system. A blind leviathan still possesses its entire nuclear arsenal on a launch-on-warning protocol, but it cannot verify a threat. It has a multi-trillion-dollar financial system that cannot clear a single transaction. This is not a hypothetical. CSIS assessments confirm the acute vulnerability of this infrastructure. Adversaries are actively running drills. The record-high cyber attacks against NATO allies like Latvia are not isolated incidents. They are rehearsals for systemic decapitation. The math is irrefutable. Why challenge a carrier group for $2 trillion when you can paralyze the nation that deployed it for a fraction of the cost? This asymmetric leverage bypasses all conventional models of deterrence. It creates a non-linear escalation protocol, shortening the path from a minor, non-kinetic incident to a full-blown national solvency crisis. The ultimate choice becomes binary: accept systemic collapse or initiate a final reflexive kinetic spasm. The primary motive is not conquest. It is solvency. When a nation's internal cohesion fractures, its conventional military ceases to be a strategic asset and becomes a domestic liability. CSIS analysis highlights this exact dynamic with Russia. A costly, unpopular kinetic war becomes a solvency-draining event, threatening the regime's own stability far more than the adversary's. This weakness forces a pivot. A state facing a systemic solvency crisis cannot afford a symmetric, kinetic conflict. The mathematical incentive is to bypass the expensive fight and deploy low-cost asymmetric vectors directly against the adversary's homeland. The objective is to trigger a parallel solvency event in the target. This strategy is observable. Economic warfare, like the U.S. oil sanctions that forced Cuba to prepare its population for a systemic collapse, becomes a primary weapon. Simultaneously, cyber attacks become the modern siege engine. As Latvia reports, cyber threats from Russia are at a record high, a constant low-cost pressure against an adversary's critical infrastructure. The adversary's calculus is irrefutable. Why engage a carrier strike group when internal fragmentation, as seen in analyses of locations like Minnesota, creates systemic vulnerabilities? This new battle space is defined by scalable, autonomous threats. The same drone swarm technology the U.S. Army is now testing to strike multiple targets at once turned against the civilian economic engine, not the military. The primary driver is the collapse of the kinetic cost curve. Data from analysts at RUSI illustrates the brutal mathematics. A single main battle tank represents a $5 to $10 million capital asset. An adversary can now neutralize this asset or terrorize a domestic supply chain using a $500 drone. This is not warfare. It is an economic arbitrage on lethality. This mechanism is the democratization of violence. The financial barrier to entry for projecting systemic-level force has been erased. The U.S. Army's own Swarm Forge demonstrations validate that this protocol is now operational doctrine. An adversary no longer needs a navy to blockade a port when a swarm will suffice. The state's monopoly on high-end kinetic power has been inverted into a systemic liability, forcing it into a zero-sum solvency trap where every defensive action accelerates its own financial collapse. Adversaries no longer plan to fight a nation's military. They plan to bankrupt it. The operational theater is not a distant battlefield. It is the fragile, internally fragmented states used as live-fire laboratories for asymmetric warfare. These are gray zones, proxy laboratories for staging and testing. While legacy media focuses on the symptom, regional chaos, they ignore its function, a low-cost R&D environment. Reports referencing Minnesota as a warning are not about local politics. They are case studies in how internal friction serves as an attack surface for external actors. This protocol is documented. In Cuba, U.S. sanctions have forced the state into a perpetual crisis mode, making it a testbed for resilience against economic strangulation. Simultaneously, Latvia reports record-high cyber attacks from Russia. These are not separate events. They are calibration points, refining the vectors that can be deployed against a primary target's systemic weaknesses. The U.S. Army's own SwarmForge program validates the kinetic model. Once a vector is proven effective in a gray zone, whether it is cyber, economic, or a drone swarm, it is ready for deployment against the homeland. This bypasses the prohibitive kinetic cost of conventional conflict, targeting domestic solvency directly. The mathematical incentive is now irreversible. The next systemic shock will not be a declaration of war. It will be the consequence of a successfully tested protocol launched from a proxy territory, triggering a liquidity crisis that no carrier group can stop. The path from regional instability to a domestic solvency event is no longer theoretical. It is operational. The Launch on Warning protocol is a systemic failsafe from the Cold War, now inverted into a systemic liability. As analysts at RUSI confirm, the doctrine dictates that a nation launches its nuclear arsenal upon detection of an incoming first strike before those assets can be neutralized. The logic is brutal. Use them or lose them. But the attack vector has changed. A peer adversary no longer needs to fire a missile to trigger this protocol. The new vector is digital, a targeted cyber attack like those Russia is reportedly deploying with record frequency against states like Latvia, creates a fog of digital war. It doesn't destroy the command center. It simply blinds the radar. On the screen, incoming kinetic strikes and a simple sensor failure look identical. In that moment of absolute uncertainty, the commander faces a solvency calculation. The cost of waiting and being wrong is national obliteration. The protocol thus forces a launch, not based on certainty, but on the mathematical absence of it. This is the new escalation ladder, from a line of code to a potential kinetic response in under 30 minutes. The adversary's next move is not kinetic. It is a calibration shot to test systemic solvency. The target is selected for maximum economic leverage with minimum physical cost, the digital logistics backbone of a primary U.S. container port, such as Los Angeles or Long Beach. Within the next 12 months, forecast a multi-day attribution impossible blackout of this system. The primary vector will be a sophisticated cyber attack, masked as ransomware and officially blamed on a non-state actor. This aligns with the record-high attack tempo reported by security services like CSIS. The cyber event will be amplified by a secondary physical vector, a low-cost, commercial drone swarm creating localized GPS and communications disruption. This mirrors the swarm tactics currently being perfected in U.S. Army test environments. The resulting chaos paralyzes the physical movement of goods, triggering an immediate supply chain crisis. The objective is not destruction, it is data. The event will measure the precise time from system failure to federal intervention, the political infighting that delays response, the Minnesota warning on a national scale, and the exact point where economic disruption threatens national liquidity. This is not a warning. It is a pre-conflict range-finding exercise.